Under the cover of absolute darkness, on September 26, 1943, 14 men sat silently in folding canoes, their hearts pounding like war drums as searchlights swept across the black waters of Singapore Harbour. They were outnumbered 10,000 to 1. One sound, one mistake, and they'd be dead before dawn. But these weren't ordinary men. These were Australian commandos on what military historians would later call the most audacious naval raid of World War II. Before we dive into this incredible true story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever heard of Operation Jaywick before tonight, what I'm about to share with you isn't just another war story. This is the account of how 14 volunteers, written off as suicidal by their own command, paddled tiny canoes into the heart of one of Japan's most fortified naval strongholds and achieved the impossible. 7 enemy ships destroyed, 0 casualties, a mission so perfect, so audacious, that even their enemies couldn't believe it had happened. This is the story of men who became ghosts, who struck like thunder, and who rewrote the rules of asymmetric warfare forever. The year is 1943, and the Pacific War is at its darkest hour for the Allies. Singapore, once called the Gibraltar of the East, has fallen to Japanese forces in what Winston Churchill described as the worst disaster in British military history. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable became a symbol of Allied humiliation. 85,000 Allied troops surrendered. The myth of Western invincibility in Asia shattered overnight. Singapore Harbour, now renamed Shonan by the Japanese occupiers, has become the beating heart of Japan's southern naval operations. Dozens of merchant ships, tankers, and warships crowd the harbour daily, fueling the Japanese war machine that's conquering the Pacific and Southeast Asia with terrifying efficiency. But in a secret operations room in Seoul, Melbourne, Australia, a plan is taking shape. A plan so dangerous, so seemingly impossible that when it's first proposed, senior military commanders dismiss it as fantasy, as guaranteed suicide. The man behind this plan is Major Ivan Lyon, a British officer who'd escaped Singapore's fall and who carried with him not just the trauma of defeat, but an intimate knowledge of Singapore's waterways and an all-consuming desire for redemption. Lyon is 32 years old, speaks Malay fluently, and possesses something rare among military planners: an imagination willing to embrace the unconventional, the radical, even the absurd if it might work. Lyon's concept is brilliantly simple and terrifyingly complex in execution. Take a small team of elite commandos, disguise an old fishing vessel as a neutral Japanese fishing boat, sail 3,000 kilometers through enemy-controlled waters, then use folding canoes, limpet mines, and absolute stealth to penetrate Singapore Harbour and destroy as much enemy shipping as possible before escaping the same way they came. No air support, no naval backup, no rescue plan if things went wrong. The official military assessment: less than 20% chance of success. The unofficial assessment among veterans: this is a one-way mission dressed up with false hope. But Lyon isn't looking for pessimists. He's looking for believers. He recruits Lieutenant Donald Davidson, a navigation genius who can read the stars like a book and calculate tidal patterns with uncanny precision. Captain Bob Page, an engineer who can turn fishing boat engines into something resembling reliability. Lieutenant Hubert Cars, whose skills with explosives border on the artistic. And then there are the enlisted men. Tough, resourceful soldiers from the Australian Imperial Force who volunteer knowing they might never return. Men like able seaman Walter Falls, Corporal Crilly, and Corporal Stewart, whose names history would almost forget, but whose courage would echo through generations. The vessel they choose is the Krait, a 60-foot Japanese-built fishing boat seized in Singapore before the fall. She's old, slow, weather-beaten, and absolutely perfect for blending into the maritime landscape of occupied Southeast Asia. They repaint her in the dull colors of a typical fishing vessel, rig her with camouflage nets, and most critically they install hidden compartments below deck for weapons, explosives, and the folding canoes that will carry them on. The final approach: the Krait becomes their Trojan horse, their ticket through thousands of miles of enemy waters. The training is exhaustive and punishing. For months, the team practices paddling the folding canoes called Cockle Mark IIs, fragile-looking kayaks that feel like they might split apart in heavy waves, but are actually engineering marvels of compact efficiency. They train at night, always at night, learning to move without splashing, to communicate without speaking, to become invisible on water that offers no cover. They practice attaching limpet mines to ship hulls underwater, working against the clock because each second of exposure is a second closer to discovery and death. They memorize Japanese patrol patterns, study aerial reconnaissance photos until they can navigate Singapore Harbour in their sleep. and drill emergency procedures for every conceivable disaster. On September 2, 1943, the Krait slips out of Exmouth Gulf in Western Australia with 14 men aboard. The first phase of their journey takes them through the Lombok Strait, threading between Japanese-occupied islands where one suspicious patrol boat could end everything. Lieutenant Davidson's navigation is flawless. They travel by night when possible, and during the day, they adopt the slow, aimless pattern of local fishermen. Several times, Japanese patrol aircraft pass overhead. The men freeze, barely breathing, their fingers on hidden weapons they know would be useless against aircraft. But the disguise holds. To the Japanese, they're just another unremarkable fishing boat in waters full of them. The psychological pressure is immense and constant. These men are sailing toward almost certain death, and they know it. At night, as the Krait's engine drones on through dark waters, they sit on deck and talk quietly about home, about families they might never see again, about the letters they've written and left behind just in case. There's Corporal Andrew Houston, who'd been a sheep farmer in Victoria and who talks about the smell of eucalyptus after rain. There's leading stoker James McDowell, who'd been a dock worker in Sydney and who entertains them with stories that make them laugh even as they sail toward potential oblivion. Major Lyon rarely sleeps. He's constantly recalculating, reassessing, adjusting the plan. He knows that leadership in a mission like this isn't about inspiring speeches. It's about competence so absolute that men will follow you into the impossible. And he knows something else. If this mission succeeds, it won't just be a tactical victory. It will be a psychological earthquake. The Japanese have built their strategy on an assumption of invulnerability in their conquered territories. A successful raid on Singapore would shatter that assumption, would show that no harbor is safe, that the war isn't over, that the Allies are still fighting and still dangerous. On September 24th, after 3 weeks at sea, the Krait reaches Pompong Island, about 30 miles from Singapore. This is as close as the fishing boat can safely approach. From here, the final assault will be conducted by canoe. The team divides into 3 two-man assault teams and a support group that will remain with the Krait. The assault pairs are Lyon and Houston, Davidson and Falls, and Page and Jones. Each team is assigned specific sectors of the harbor and specific types of targets. The planning is so detailed that they know not just which ships to hit, but in what order, at what times, to maximize confusion and minimize the risk of early detection. The canoes are prepared with ritualistic care. Each one carries multiple limpet mines, provisions for several days, weapons that will likely be useless if they're discovered, and maps encased in waterproof materials. The limpet mines themselves are elegant in their simplicity. Magnetic devices that attach to a ship's hull below the waterline, equipped with time delay fuses that will give the WWII attackers hours to escape before the explosions begin. Each mine carries enough explosive to tear a massive hole in a ship's hull, enough to sink or cripple even a large vessel. As the sun sets on September 26th, the 6 men in 3 canoes push off from Pompong Island. The water is black, the moon is dark, and the silence is profound. They paddle in perfect synchronization, their movements economical and whisper quiet. The distance to Singapore Harbour is approximately 30 miles, which means they'll be paddling through enemy waters for hours before they even begin their attack. Lieutenant Davidson leads navigation using dead reckoning and an almost supernatural sense of direction. There are no landmarks visible in the darkness, just the rhythm of paddles, the tension in their shoulders, and the certainty that they're paddling deeper and deeper into the enemy's grip. Around midnight, the lights of Singapore begin to appear on the horizon. The sight is both beautiful and terrifying. This is one of the most heavily defended harbors in the world. Patrol boats sweep the waters constantly. Searchlights mounted on shore installations and ships sweep the darkness. Guard posts are positioned every few hundred meters around the harbor perimeter. Anti-submarine nets protect the main shipping channels. The harbor itself is a maze of anchored vessels, with dozens of ships packed into relatively confined waters. One guard who's more alert than usual, one searchlight that lingers a moment too long, and these men will die in a hail of machine gun fire before they can even detach a single mine. But the Commandos have advantages the Japanese don't anticipate. The folding canoes sit so low in the water that they're nearly invisible, especially against the dark backdrop of the harbor's far shore. The Japanese are looking for submarines or larger surface vessels, not tiny kayaks paddled by ghosts. And crucially, the sheer audacity of the raid works in their favor. The idea that enemy commandos would paddle canoes dozens of miles through hostile waters to attack Singapore is so absurd that Japanese commanders haven't seriously prepared for it. The three teams separate as they enter the outer harbor, each heading toward their assigned sectors. Lyon and Houston paddle toward the northern section where reconnaissance has identified tankers and merchant ships. Davidson and Falls head toward the roads, the main anchorage area. Page and Jones take the eastern sector. The Isyoha. Coordination is loose by necessity. Once separated, each team is on its own, making decisions in real time based on targets of opportunity and tactical realities on the ground. Lyon and Houston approach their first target around 2 a.m. It's a large tanker, approximately 10,000 tons, sitting low in the water, probably full of fuel desperately needed by Japanese forces throughout the region. They glide alongside the hull in complete silence. The ship towers above them, a steel cliff that blocks out the stars. From somewhere on deck they can hear voices, guards talking in Japanese, the glow of cigarettes visible as small orange points in the darkness. Lyon slips into the water with barely a ripple. The water is warm, almost blood temperature, and thick with oil and debris. He swims beneath the surface to the ship's hull, his hands finding the steel, his fingers working quickly to attach the first Limpet mine. The mine makes a soft magnetic click as it attaches to the hull. 2-4. Lyon, the sound seems deafeningly loud, but no alarm is raised above. He attaches a second mine, then a third, spacing them along the hull to ensure maximum damage. Each mine's timer is set for 7 hours, which will give them time to hit multiple targets and begin their escape before the first explosion. Lyon surfaces slowly, his face barely breaking the water, and swims back to the canoe where Houston waits with the paddle ready for a quick escape if needed. They move to a second target, a large merchant ship anchored nearby. The process repeats with mechanical precision. Approach in silence. One man attaches the mines while the other keeps the canoe steady and watches for patrols. Withdraw like shadows and move to the next target. With each ship they successfully mine, the risk increases because they're deeper into the harbor, more surrounded by enemy vessels and shore installations, with more ways to be trapped if discovery comes. Meanwhile, Davidson and Falls are experiencing their own terrifying success. They find the roads crowded with ships, target-rich environment in military parlance, and they systematically work their way from vessel to vessel. Davidson, the meticulous navigator, approaches each ship with the same careful attention to detail he brings to navigation. Falls, younger and less experienced but fearless, matches his partner's calm professionalism even as his heart hammers with adrenaline. At one point, a patrol boat's searchlight sweeps directly toward their position. They freeze absolutely still, the light passing within meters of their canoe, and somehow, impossibly, the light continues past without pausing. The darkness that seemed like their enemy becomes their protector. Page and Jones, in the eastern sector, encounter a complication. One of their assigned targets has moved from its expected position. Rather than abort, Page makes a command decision to target an alternative vessel, a large cargo ship that reconnaissance hadn't even identified. This kind of adaptive thinking, this willingness to improvise within the mission's framework, is what separates elite operators from ordinary soldiers. They attach their minds and move on, their confidence growing with each successful attachment, even as they know that confidence can be fatal if it leads to carelessness. By 5 a.m., as the sky begins to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the three teams have completed their attacks and begun the long paddle back toward the rendezvous point at Pompong Island. They've attached mines to 7 ships, 3 large tankers, 3 freighters, and 1 ammunition ship. If the mines function as designed, the explosions will begin around 10 a.m., and by then, the Commandos need to be 30 miles away, hidden, and preparing for the long journey home. The paddle back is even more dangerous than the approach because they're exhausted, their arms burning with lactic acid, and the growing daylight makes them increasingly visible. They paddle with desperate determination, knowing that every minute closer to dawn is a minute closer to exposure. At one point, Davidson's team passes within 100 meters of a Japanese patrol boat. They're so close they can see the faces of the guards, can hear conversations. Davidson and Falls barely breathe, maintaining their steady paddle rhythm, acting like they belong there, like they're just local fishermen heading out for an early start. The Japanese guards glance at them but don't react. Evo dias. Disguise. The audacity, the sheer impossibility of what they're doing provides its own camouflage. By 8 a.m., all 3 teams have reached Pompong Island and rejoined the Krait. The men are physically destroyed, their hands blistered and bleeding from hours of paddling, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline come down. But they're alive, and they've succeeded. Major Lyon allows himself a brief moment of satisfaction, but only brief, because they're still in enemy waters, and the hardest part might still be ahead. The moment those mines explode, the Japanese will launch a massive search operation. Every ship, every aircraft, every patrol boat in the region will be hunting for them. The Krait's engines roar to life and they begin moving away from Singapore as quickly as the old fishing boat can manage. The crew tries to rest, but no one can sleep. They're listening, waiting, watching the clock. At 10:15 a.m., still within sight of Singapore's skyline, they hear it, a deep rolling boom that echoes across the water like thunder. Then another and another. 7 explosions in total, spaced over about 20 minutes. The commandos on the Krait's deck look at each other in stunned disbelief. It actually worked. Every single mine detonated, every single target hit. From Singapore, the scene is chaos beyond imagination. The first explosion tears through the tanker Shinkoku Maru, a 5,000-ton vessel loaded with fuel. The ship's hull ruptures and burning fuel pours into the harbor waters, creating a spreading inferno. Within minutes, the second and third tankers explode in sequence, each one adding to a growing firestorm that's turning Singapore Harbour into an apocalyptic vision. The freighters, damaged below the waterline, begin listing heavily, sirens wailing, crews scrambling to lifeboats. The ammunition ship's explosion is particularly spectacular, secondary detonations ripping through the vessel as stored munitions cook off in the heat. Japanese commanders are in absolute disbelief. How did this happen? Air raid? No aircraft detected. Submarine? The anti-submarine nets are intact. Sabotage? But how could saboteurs penetrate the most heavily defended harbor in Southeast Asia? The investigation begins immediately, but the evidence is confusing and contradictory. Some witnesses report seeing small boats in the darkness, but this seems absurd. Small boats against Singapore's defenses? Impossible. The Japanese High Command entertains increasingly desperate theories. Secret Allied submarines with new technology, underwater demolition teams delivered by aircraft, even Chinese resistance fighters with inside help. The truth, that 14 men in a fishing boat and folding canoes had done this, seems too preposterous to consider seriously. And this psychological impact, this shattering of assumed invulnerability, is almost more valuable than the physical damage, though the physical damage is substantial. 7 ships destroyed or severely damaged represents thousands of tons of shipping capacity removed from Japanese logistics. The fuel lost from the tankers would have powered dozens of aircraft, multiple ship movements, and ground operations. But more importantly, every Japanese commander in the Pacific now has to consider the possibility that their harbors, their bases, their assumed safe zones are penetrable. For the men aboard the Krait, the journey home is a test of endurance and nerve that rivals the raid itself. They know the Japanese will be searching frantically, and they know their old fishing boat can't outrun modern patrol vessels. Their only hope is the same strategy that got them here. Blend in, move like locals, hide in plain sight among the maritime traffic of the region. For 3 weeks they thread through enemy waters, constantly adjusting course based on patrol sightings, sometimes stopping and pretending to fish when suspicious vessels approach, always listening to radio traffic for signs that they've been detected. The psychological toll is immense. Having achieved the impossible, having struck their blow and survived the raid itself, the idea of being caught during the escape is almost unbearable. They've come so far, risked so much. Some of the men, in quiet moments, talk about what they'll do when they get home, but they speak in conditional terms, as if describing someone else's future rather than their own. Major Lyon, maintaining his stoic leadership, privately wonders if his luck has finally run out, if this improbable success will end with capture or death just miles from safety. On October 19th, after 47 days at sea, the Krait enters Exmouth Gulf. The lookout spots the silhouette of Australian shore installations, and grown men weep with relief. They've done it. They've achieved what military experts called impossible, what their own commanders calculated at 20% survival odds. 0 casualties, 7 enemy ships destroyed, 3,000 kilometers traveled through enemy waters, both ways, without detection. It's a military miracle. The intelligence officers who debrief them are skeptical at first. The claims seem too successful, too perfect. 7 ships? All mines functioned? No casualties, no detection. But as the team provides detailed accounts, corroborated by multiple witnesses and supported by Japanese radio traffic intercepted during the aftermath, the reality sinks in. This small team has achieved one of the most successful sabotage operations of the entire war. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The men of Operation Jaywick expect medals, recognition, perhaps a hero's welcome. Instead, they're sworn to absolute secrecy. The operation is classified at the highest level, and they're forbidden from discussing it with anyone, including family. The military reasoning is sound. If the Japanese know exactly how the raid was conducted, they'll adjust their defenses, making future operations impossible. But for the men who risked everything, the secrecy is a strange, hollow reward. Major Ivan Lyon, never satisfied with one victory, immediately begins planning Operation Rimau, an even more ambitious raid on Singapore. He recruits many of the same men from Jaywick, their success having earned them his complete trust. But Rimau will end in tragedy. In September 1944, Lyon and his team are detected during their approach. A firefight erupts. Some men are killed in combat. Others are captured and, in violation of international law, are executed by the Japanese. Lyon himself dies in the fighting, never knowing that his first raid had already secured his place in military history. The captured Rimau raiders face mock trials and certain death. They're tortured for information but reveal nothing of value. On July 7, 1945, just weeks before Japan's surrender, 10 Rimau survivors are beheaded in Singapore. These men, who'd achieved the impossible on Jaywick, die as prisoners. Their success in the first raid making their failure in the second all the more tragic. But their sacrifice isn't meaningless. The intelligence gathered during Rimau, transmitted before capture, helps Allied forces understand Japanese defenses in the region. The story of Operation Jaywick remains classified until well after the war. When it's finally declassified in the 1950s, historians and military analysts are stunned. The operational details reveal a level of planning, courage, and execution that seems almost superhuman. The raid becomes a case study at military academies worldwide, analyzed for its lessons on asymmetric warfare, the value of surprise, and the power of small, highly trained teams against seemingly superior forces. For the survivors of Jaywick, life after the war is complicated. They carry the weight of their lost comrades from Rimau, the knowledge that their success led Lyon to attempt an even more dangerous mission that ended in death. Some speak publicly once the operation is declassified. Others prefer silence, feeling that the true story can never be adequately told, that the terror and triumph of those nights in Singapore Harbour is beyond words. They meet occasionally at veterans' gatherings, aging men whose greatest adventure occurred when they were young, men who paddled through darkness and changed the course of a war. The Japanese perspective on Operation Jaywick is fascinating. After the war, former Japanese commanders admit that the raid fundamentally changed their defensive posture throughout the Pacific. Resources that could have been used offensively were instead diverted to harbor defense, coastal patrols, and anti-sabotage measures. The psychological impact of knowing that Allied commandos had penetrated Singapore created a persistent paranoia that affected decision-making at the highest levels. In a very real sense, 14 men in folding canoes forced an empire to look over its shoulder. There's a deeper lesson in Operation Jaywick that transcends military strategy. It's a lesson about the power of the underestimated, about what's possible when courage meets meticulous planning, about how a small group of determined individuals can achieve what large conventional forces cannot. The Japanese had thousands of troops defending Singapore. They had patrol boats, aircraft, searchlights, and sophisticated detection systems. And yet 14 men in kayaks defeated all of it through intelligence, stealth, and audacity. This story resonates because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit. The belief that no fortress is truly impregnable. That creativity and courage can overcome numerical and technological superiority. That sometimes the most effective strategy is the one nobody expects because it seems too crazy to work. The Commandos of Jaywick didn't defeat the Japanese through superior firepower. They won through superior thinking, through a willingness to attempt what others dismissed as impossible. In the decades since Operation Jaywick, special operations forces around the world have studied and emulated its principles. The raid influenced the development of commando units in dozens of countries. The tactics used, the small team approach, the emphasis on stealth over force, the use of unconventional insertion methods, all became hallmarks of modern special operations. The Navy SEALs, the SAS, and countless other elite units trace part of their doctrinal lineage back to what Lyon and his men proved possible in Singapore Harbour. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of this story is what it reveals about the nature of courage. These men weren't superhuman. They experienced fear, doubt, and exhaustion. They had families they wanted to return to, lives they wanted to live. But when asked to volunteer for a mission with minimal survival odds, they said yes. Not because they didn't understand the risks, but because they understood that some things are worth the risk. Freedom is worth the risk. The defeat of tyranny is worth the risk. The protection of their nation and their comrades is worth the risk. The story of Operation Jaywick is ultimately a story about the human capacity for extraordinary achievement in the face of impossible odds. It's about 14 men who were given a mission that experts said couldn't be done and who did it anyway. It's about leadership that inspired absolute trust, about teamwork that functioned flawlessly under unimaginable pressure, and about courage that manifested not as fearlessness, but as the determination to act despite fear. If you found this story as incredible as I did, do me a favor, hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates real history and genuine heroism, and subscribe to the channel because there are so many more untold stories like this that deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and let me know. Had you heard of Operation Jaywick before today? And what other incredible military operations should I cover next? The men of Operation Jaywick teach us that the impossible is often just the untried, that conventional wisdom about what can't be done is frequently wrong, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest teams with the biggest courage. In a world that often feels dominated by large systems and overwhelming forces, Operation Jaywick reminds us that determined individuals still matter, that creativity and courage can still change outcomes, and that darkness can be a cover not just for retreat but for advancement. Remember their names, remember what they achieved, and remember that on one September night in 1943, 14 men proved that no harbor is safe from those who dare to paddle through the darkness.